I'm going to read now two what I call postcards. The first was a little message written to send to a conference in Greece being held in honour of an old friend called Frank Moulert, who's been leading research in Europe for many years on urban issues. And I didn't think I was going to be able to attend the conference, so I sent this kind of postcard to this assembled international gathering about London as it was then in 2017. Forgive a short message from our offshore island, written in moments diverted from challenging the neoliberal framing of our city's narrative, watching the eviction of people from their homes and the expulsion of foreign friends from their city of choice, and now suddenly grappling with an intractable parliamentary election. All that is solid melts into air. London is a big city by European standards. 10 to 15 million people maybe, but that's as precise as one can be. Its administrative area was already too small when it was defined in 1965, and it becomes ever more so as its growth sucks commuters in from much of England and migrants from everywhere, flinging out others who can't afford to stay or prefer to leave. We know the importance of multi-scale relationships though. Local ones, London ones, international ones, European ones. And we live with distinct layers of localised and larger social and political experiences across the city and across the towns, villages and countryside which make up the London region. Various capitalisms surviving under one queen, the rentier par excellence, but a country increasingly financialised and divided. The dominant discourse about London is so familiar. City leaders, almost all of the political parties, policy communities and experts, professions, and the mainstream media are proud of its rate of population growth, its GDP growth, its prowess in fostering innovation and entrepreneurship, the light touch regulation of its financial, housing and labour markets, its cultural richness, its universities and its youth. A wonderful place. We love it. And it's the engine of the nation. Something like that. Policy is crafted to sustain and extend this preeminence, with much reliance on the benefits of agglomeration as a convenient and reassuring rationalisation. The co-location in London of state functions, diplomacy, finance, business headquarters, elite universities, including Oxford and Cambridge, just an hour from the centre, and leading cultural institutions, has been a winning combination, of course. All speaking English, but with hundreds of other languages on tap. This magic might even, we are told, carry us through our separation from the European Union. It can also be presented as slightly green. Public transport is elaborate, expanding and popular. We have reversed the growth of car ownership and use, and cycling is booming. But London is a poverty machine as well as a wealth machine, and has been for centuries. Harvesting the value produced under slavery in the former empire and under capitalism in the post-imperial world. Exploiting too its resident working class in making the coffee, cleaning up, doing the caring, building, driving and security jobs to support the growth. So it's a city of mounting inequalities, and it's not so green either. Its road space is increasingly filled with diesel vehicles, delivering online orders and ferrying passengers who summon them by apps. The air is illegally toxic, and we don't even count our massive use of air travel and container shipping when we calculate our pollution load. Well, much of that could be said of other cities in the world. But there are some distinctive London or British features in our experience. Above all, Britain embodies the strong survival and periodic renewal of the privileges attaching to land ownership. Monarchy and aristocracy were never abolished, and the early evolution of capitalism benefited from the channeling of old landed wealth into capitalist enterprise. In the expansion of a slave-based empire, in the innovations of factory and mining production, and in speculative urban development and infrastructure. Landowning interests have retained through all this powerful privileges in taxation, in their contractual relationships with tenants, both residential and commercial, in inheritance law and tax, and in political representation. The privatisation of common land in earlier centuries has a natural continuity with today's enclosures of public space, commodification of collective assets, and subordination of public planning to private profit. All of this has generated great contradictions along the way, as private land ownership has blocked and distorted the evolution of infrastructure and cities, prevented the efficient housing of the population, and starved local administrations of revenue. Modern London is substantially a product of successive waves of speculative investment, but also contains the products of important class struggles in the form of extensive social housing, mainly distributed through the inner neighbourhoods, where left-wing local authorities built workers' housing in the 20th century. This has given inner parts of London, and some outer parts, a rather fine-grained mixing of social class, and some inoculation against rapid gentrification, rapid transformation. It's a distinctive feature of the city, very different from most European cities, this fine-grained mixing. And it's a feature we had rather taken for granted until about the turn of the millennium. The other important and distinctive inheritance here is the planning system established after World War II as part of the social democratic settlement and the policies and practices which have developed it in the subsequent decades. In particular, London is surrounded by a green belt, now merging into other restrictive designations of open land further out, which extend far into the surrounding regions, preventing lateral urban growth or forcing it to be spaced out with all this green space in between. And within the urban areas, we have many restrictive designations protecting neighbourhood character, architectural interest, views, landscapes. The market in housing has become also a market in proximity to these amenities, to the best schools, in a highly unequal education system and to the best environments. A few of us argue about the theorisation of these rent and property market processes, which of the payments made are monopoly rents, absolute rents or differential rents. But we all agree that rent is a massive allocator and redistributor of the social product. It's a major mechanism, making London a poverty machine and a wealth machine, sucking money from the pockets of low and middle income people and turning it into the wealth and income of people at the top end. It's in these specific London conditions that housing market demand has surged. It's been a combination of population growth, income growth for the rich, who then tend to acquire more housing, as richer people do, policy and subsidy support by governments for expanding ownership and for capital accumulation. And all that supercharged by 3 decades of credit expansion and pervasive financialisation. Overall, this has been a financialised boom in house prices, with Britain, over the last 40 years or so, the fastest escalating country for house prices in the whole of the OECD. Affordability falls, and the proportion of households in owner occupation, which had been rising since 1918, peaked in the 1990s and has fallen as more dwellings are switched to private renting, a tenure form almost completely unregulated in Britain and highly insecure for tenants. More and more households are driven to rent privately at almost all income levels. Better paid workers who can't yet afford to buy, and perhaps never will, and poorer workers who would in former times have entered social housing. But the social housing sector has shrunk steadily through privatisation and is now rapidly eroding as many housing providers, so-called social housing providers, raise their rents closer and closer to market levels. In real terms, after you allow for housing costs, London median incomes are among the lowest in the UK and have recovered more slowly than other regions since the credit crunch of 2007-8. So London workers are thus simply unable to compete in this bloated housing market. That contradiction had been partly bridged by housing benefit, a part of the social security regime which governments capped in a desperate attempt to contain its escalating cost. Wages remain low and static for much of the population, while rents continue to escalate. The outcomes are an accelerated displacement of poorer people to cheaper areas, often far from London, growing overcrowding, broken and dispersed communities, homelessness, ill health, and disruption of schooling. Another outcome is mounting household debt. Mainstream economists point out how well our unregulated private rental sector meets the needs of a dynamic international economy. Anyone arriving in London can find housing to suit their purse and their preferences within a day. A penthouse or a villa if you're rich, a shared bed in a damp cellar if you're poor, and everything in between. Perhaps this is what they mean by a perfect market. Finally, the housing crisis has become a crisis for the productive economy. Since land used for industry, workshops and other economic activity can be sold at prices between 3 and 10 times higher if it can be switched to speculative housing use. Planners, under strong pressure from politicians, and all of them bewitched by supply-side economics, have permitted and encouraged this switch, ignoring the erasure of economic life and useful services which had existed on this land, and often ignoring the disproportionate impact on ethnic minorities of those changes. In this context, there are beginnings of resistance. Untidy coalitions of housing tenants, always rather fragmented by the different kinds of landlords they confront. Environmentalists, Extinction Rebellion, small and medium enterprises, and neighbourhood associations. London has always had a tradition of micro-local activism, and the challenge has been, and is, how to knit local struggles with policy debates at citywide scale. My own involvement has been with the Just Space network, in which about 100 organisations support each other in this activity, building up both organisational capacity and counter-narratives to the neoliberal orthodoxy. This is the forging of new communities of practice, especially in the governance of landed commons, the streets, green space, water spaces, and the social housing estates, so hated and demonised by the elites. And also now in challenging the London plan itself. In the present conjuncture, this was written in 2017, in the present conjuncture we have the national state pumping billions into radial transport infrastructure so that this growth of London can continue, fuelling land and property markets where the value is harvested by owners of land and housing, investors, and their attendant professions. The local state fosters densification on multiple fronts, though not in the most privileged areas, everywhere else, and prices open new investment opportunities on former social housing and industrial sites. The central bank, the Bank of England, is aware that the financial system is at risk of this bubble bursting, because the asset value of the building stock is something like 80% of all the tangible assets in the country. We shall see. Meanwhile, the challenge is to grow the critiques and the resistance from the bottom up, maintaining exchanges with other geographic scales and with movements in other regions and countries. So that's the end of the 2017 postcard, and the shorter one, written now, goes like this. Now we are in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. The COVID experience is, to begin with, exposing and dramatising some of the less visible pathologies of the city. Overcrowding of low and middle income people in the housing stock fosters infection. It is impossible to self-isolate. Care homes and prisons could perhaps be made safe places if adequately resourced with staff and equipment. But starved of both, they are death traps. Middle and upper classes have second homes to retreat to, or at least gardens and balconies in London. Working at home is familiar or feasible for many office workers, but for most personal service and working class jobs, you only get paid if you travel to your workplace. And the transport network is itself a major spreading hazard for the infection. So in all these ways, the class society becomes so very visible. The growth of household debt, which I referred to earlier, means that so many households have no financial buffer and face destitution when work stops. And government has refused to adopt a universal basic income. The patchwork of emergency supports is inadequate and full of gaps. Arrears of rent and mortgage payments are thus mounting up in all the rental housing sectors, and a delayed wave of evictions threatens. Especially terrible is the mounting evidence of the discriminatory impacts on black and ethnic minority people, as deeply entrenched occupational and housing and health inequalities are sharpened by the management practices of health, care, transport and construction sectors. On the other hand, we discover how wonderfully air quality improves when traffic stops, and that the city became as safe and quiet as Venice suddenly. We discover our immediate neighbours, and we discover our immediate neighbourhoods as pedestrians. We also discover that state power and money could be used to requisition unused hotel rooms for the street homeless to self-isolate, though not yet empty housing or Airbnb. Perhaps most important so far is the widespread realisation that the value of people's work to society is almost inversely related to their rate of pay and their conditions. The valuation placed on the products of bankers, lawyers and accountants relative to nurses and bus drivers has given London its massive GDP, but also its gross exploitation, now more transparent than ever. When we look back in a few years, perhaps we'll also focus on the fabulous proliferation of local self-help networks, rent strikes and other grassroots initiatives as citizens take their own actions in response to a failing state and incapacitated local governments. So what does all this mean for the city? Well, quick reaction pundits are already writing about the death of the city. And there are different versions. The exodus of upper echelons to the provinces, or the accelerated expulsion of the working classes to the provinces. Curtains for high-density living, or a golden age for high-density living. You can find all these in the quick journalism of urban studies. Let's all go back to suburban life with electric cars. We just have to hope and insist that careful analysis and unpacking inform whatever happens next. Otherwise, the property and finance interests which rule us will simply latch on to the glib diagnosis which suits their needs best, and we'll be back to the old normal, just with extra bike lanes. It is deeply alarming, but also it has gleams of light for potential change. And remember that hard on the heels of COVID-19 come the bigger tsunamis of Brexit and climate change, and their attendant vultures. Thank you. Good evening.